Central Asia. And so that is the story of the global spread of paper. Now this map doesn't show what happened in India. India also became a center for producing paper. For many centuries, they imported paper from Central Asia, from Khorasan, etc. But places like Kashmir, Sialkot, they became also renowned for their quality of paper producing in the 1400s, 1500s, and so forth. And so the Muslim world supplied a huge bulk of paper to Europe for many centuries until around the 15th, 16th century, when the tides kind of reversed and the Italians and the French became experts at producing paper. So they had lots of really high gushing rivers in their lands, and they were able to produce better quality water mills to produce the paper. And they began exporting paper to the Muslim world, to the Ottoman Empire. And there are actually many fatwa that came about during that time on whether or not it's acceptable for Muslims to use paper produced in Christian lands, and whether or not that's permissible, whether they can use it for writing MUSHAFS, for Qur'ans, and so forth. But for many centuries thereafter, European mills began to supply paper to the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. But in India, for instance, their paper production continued for several centuries. One of the things to notice is that England didn't produce its paper mills in large proportion until the 1850s. So it's kind of late in producing paper as compared to the rest of Europe. But once it did in the 1850s, it, along with the US, began a paper revolution using wood to produce, to import paper to large portions of the world. Another thing I want to highlight here is that there was a huge demand for paper in sub-Saharan Africa as well. Even though they were not, North Africa was producing the paper, sub-Saharan Africa, trans-Saharan Africa was heavily invested in paper. And there are there's lots of evidence to show that after gold, after camels, after slaves, books were one of the most prized commodities, even just for trading in these long caravan-based economies from the 12th century onwards to the 18th century, 19th century. And so many people would put their investments in books because they knew that books could survive durably for a period of time, and they would retain their value as well. And just to give you one idea, in around the 1450s, there's a famous book, Kitab al-Shifa of Qadi Iyad, the Andalusian Muslim scholar. It's one of the most famous, renowned books on the Prophet ﷺ. This book was sold for, according to the sources, what is the equivalent of around 200 grams of gold, which I believe equals to around $10,000. And so people were buying books. Those with means were able to buy these books and give them such value. And so from here, I'll just give you a glimpse of some of the textual features of manuscripts, of what working with manuscripts looks like. So the first thing is the title page. Manuscripts sometimes don't have title pages. It's just to give you a taste of what it is working with manuscripts. So for instance, over here, we do have a very plain, simple title page with just the title listed, the Kitab Adab Manazil, written by Sayyid Nidhamuddin Muhammad Zada, so forth. Just very simple, plain. But here we have much more inscriptions, much more writing. So here is the book, Al-Amam Li'iqad al-Himam, a book on hadith, and here's the author's name. And then all over here we have other inscriptions saying that, oh, this entered in the ownership of so-and-so person in this year. This person bought it for this amount in this year. Well, here it's waqf, it's endowed to the library of a particular person. And here we have an ijazah that I read this from a teacher, so who authorized me in this text. And so all of these clues, this goes back to the point I was mentioning where each manuscript is important, and it gives you a sense of the individual history of that manuscript. Who was reading it? Who was owning it? Where was it traveling? Where was it going? In the case of this book, this is a book of hadith. I came across it in a library in Sindh, Pakistan. It's a collection of the asanid, of the genealogies of teachers that famous muhaddith of the Hijaz, Ibrahim al-Qurani, one of the grand teachers of Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, produced. And so this copy was actually written or copied by the grandson of the author himself. And it traveled all the way from the Hijaz to Sindh, showing that people in Sindh, in Pakistan, were reading, or not Pakistan at the time, but Sindh, were reading his books produced in Medina. So this is an example of the cross-cultural, trans-regional connections. And sometimes you just have titles written very loosely just ahead of the main text. This is a book on Ottoman history, actually in UCLA Special Collections, Tawarikh Ali Osman, one of the earliest histories of the Ottoman dynasty. So you get a variety of features depending on the usage of the text. This is a book of hadith, of the chains of hadith, though it was passed heavily from students to teachers from many centuries. And then you also have another place where titles are written. Titles would be written on the bottom, on the stack of pages on the side. So, and you'll notice the reason why. If you look at this library here, this library from Medina in the 20th century, all the books are stacked on their sides. They're not stacked on their spines like we do today. And so the titles of the books would be written on the sides so you can read, you can know what you're looking at over there. And I just want to highlight another feature, which is the waqf stamp. A lot of these manuscripts would be stamped. These could be ownership stamps or authorship stamps, but they could also be waqf stamps, saying that these are endowed to a particular library. In this case, this is a book of Hanafi fiqh, which is endowed to the Maktaba Mahmudiyya in Medina al-Munawwara, which was established by the Ottomans in the 1820s, 1830s in Medina. It became one of the major libraries over there. And so this goes to another point, which is the importance of endowments in preserving Islamic manuscripts, libraries. You know, when manuscripts came about, when there was a huge boom in writing books, which supported all of the major intellectual enterprises, from the development of the four madhahib, as well as other madhahib, to the writing down of the hadith books, the compilation of hadith books. All of these were supported in some way with the emergence of paper, which made that possible. But they were also supported by the efforts of Muslims to collect and gather these books, these manuscripts, and preserve them in a way with a waqf, with an endowment, which would basically state that they are meant to reside in this library forever, and sometimes they could reserve some economic assets to support them, whether it's some agricultural land, whether it's some bazaars. The money from that would go for the upkeep of the books, to preserve them, to staff a librarian, to a bookkeeper who could look after them, and so forth. And this is something that would be founded by most of the wealthy notables in a given city, in Cairo, in Damascus, in Istanbul, what have you. This is what they would partake in. This is part of their culture at the time, where they would be endowing libraries. There wasn't this concept of a public library where you could go, anyone can go and enter and check out a book. But there were these private libraries, in addition to palace libraries, which were the much more expensive and massive undertakings. And so after we go from the title page, right, I'll just show you some examples of like the first pages of manuscripts. So we usually start with the Basmala, with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now, depending on the manuscript, it could be embellished in very nice decoration, like this book in the center, or the image at the far left. And I'll just show you briefly what they are. So this over here is actually a copy of the Masnavi of Rumi. And you could see the layout of the text as well as in columns to accommodate the poetry. And it has a nice headpiece on top with very beautiful white gold title ink against a golden background. And then you have here a book of hadith as well, the Masharikh al-Anwar. Both of these are at the UCLA library. You have the book of Masharikh al-Anwar, which also has this decoration. And that decoration gives you a sense of the importance of the book, the way in which people try to adorn these manuscripts. And then you also have the main text block, right? So this is a book of prose, so it's going to just have one regular text block. but then it will have writings on the sides. And these are what's called marginalia. These could be commentaries, these could be critiques, these could be the notes of students working on them, these could be tidbits of whoever is happening to come across them. But these also give you a sense of how the book was being interacted with. How are people engaging with these materials? Was it just blank? Nowadays, was it just like reading it from cover to end and then moving on? Or were they actually writing on it? Was it being used for teaching? Were there other annotations being used? And again, these are also all part of the puzzle of understanding how were the manuscripts being received and used at the time. And it also shows you, like, was it as important to be commented upon or not? Sometimes you'll find like random things, sometimes you'll find critiques of the stories. Now, if you were to access a printed edition of this book, it wouldn't have all of that, most likely, unless if they included some of the commentaries. So this is what you gain from going back to the original manuscripts of a text. And then moving on, just random pages from the center of a book. So you could see here, the margins can be empty, can be full, depending on how people interacted on them, depending on what kind of commentaries there were. But there's usually a standard text block that people would write within. And then towards the end, you typically have what are called colophons, which form a triangular shape. This is like by design. And that will give you the information typically of the author, of whoever wrote it, of the scribe who copied it down, maybe some dates, maybe some other notes, some annotations. You often have requests for prayers like, please pray for me, whoever reads this book after I've passed away, pray for my parents, pray for my teachers. And this is where you get some details as to like who wrote the book, if it's a good colophon. Sometimes it's just empty. And so here you have a writing by the scribe, Al-Khattu Baqi wal-Umru Fani wal-Abdu Asi wal-Rabbu Afi. That writing is impermanent, it will go, writing is permanent, it will last for a long time, but living life itself will end soon. And the servant is a sinner, and Allah, the Lord, is a forgiver, is one who will forgive. So you have these kind of annotations over there. So yeah, that was just over here, just on the side. So this is the bulk of, this is just to give you a very brief picture of the bulk of Muslim intellectual production for many, many centuries. It's a very, very limited, small picture overview of what happened. But most of the surviving manuscripts we have come from the 14th to the 19th centuries just because of the huge volume of production, but also the preservation that was done. It's easier for them to survive when they are younger. And then print came along in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And that was the era when people still do it, but that was the era when people would scour the Muslim world for manuscripts, try to find copies of a single title, so try to find 5 manuscripts of a single title, and then use that to print a critical edition of a book, which would be printed out in letterpress or lithograph. But this will be the subject of the next session we have. There's so much you could talk about in terms of the calligraphy, the styles, the influence this has had on intellectual culture for the next millennia. I'll just give a very, very brief example from MUSHAFS, the manuscripts of the Quranic MUSHAFS. And so you might have sometimes wondered about, some MUSHAFs, or most commonly MUSHAFs do have this feature where the ayah will end at the page and it won't continue through the next page. So every page will have an ayah ending at the very end. And there might be a certain number of lines on that page. And so this feature actually came about in the Ottoman period in the 16th century. It was called the Ayat Barakinar system, where every single ayah would fit towards the end of the page. And this is a manuscript this is a Mus'haf, also ECLA, from the 1830s, where you see this happening, where each page is ending, each ayah is ending at the page. And so the reason why this particular feature, Ayat al-Kinar, became popular was because it was used as an aid in memorization. For people doing hifz, this was very helpful for them to produce like a visual memory, a visual layout of each page. But there are also other reasons. So in the beginning, around the 16th, 17th century, Qur'ans are written in this fashion, would sometimes be in 13 lines. But around the 18th century, they came to center around 15 lines. So there would be 15 lines. And by the 1850s, or the 1750s, that was the most popular way of writing MUSHAFS. And so 15 lines, and each juz would fit into 20 pages. And so that also had a particular reason. When you have a codex, it has a codicological reason, or in terms of just how paper is stacked. When you have a codex, when you take a piece of paper, you fold it in half, and that forms, I wish it did have some paper to work with to show as an example. I don't know where the booklet I passed around is now. Essentially, when you stack paper around, there are several ways in which you can stack them. You can stack them twice over. You can stack them 4 times over. The typical thing would be, thank you. Okay, so this is just a regular notebook. And so you can see here that paper has been stacked over and around. Is this yours? Thank you. Paper has been stacked. A certain number of papers have been stacked here to form, and then they're bounded together. The most common number of folios that would be stacked together throughout the Ottoman Empire would be 10. And it has a term for it. It's called a quinion. It's a very technical term. But 10 folios would be stacked together, forming 20 pages. And so that would enable scribes to work very conveniently with each juz, having each juz a separate stack of 10 papers that they could add to the mushaf. And so that also made them interchangeable. So if they needed to take out a juz, put it somewhere else, if they wanted to compile them, it became very easy for them to work with this interchangeable units of ajza. And so that was also another reason why this particular system of mushafs, the 15-liner, became very popular, because it also fit the dimensions of the page better. So that's just one example of some of the elements that have, retained the popularity. This Ayat al-Kinar system was adopted also very heavily in Southeast Asia in the 19th century, and we formed a major influence on the way Quran, the mushafs are printed there as well. And it was before that, it was kind of unique to the Ottomans. The Mughals didn't necessarily care as much about producing musahif with ayahs ending at the page. Many times, if you look at the more ornamental, courtly musahif, they're very well done, but they continue through different pages because their intention was not for hifz or memorization, but more for decoration and embellishment and so forth. So just to wrap up very quickly, this is a very, very small glimpse of some of the main features we find from the legacy of Islamic manuscripts, which continued for 1,200, 1,300 years. In some places, it's still present today. A huge element of our tradition that many times we completely lose sight of, especially in the age of the smartphone and PDFs and downloading things. This gives us a testament to how people would have to, spend hours and hours. It became a career for them to reproduce manuscripts, to write them all out by hand, and to make sure that people in future generations would have access to that knowledge. And so manuscripts, form the physical remnants of our past. Not all of them have been processed or cataloged. Not all of them are in perfect condition. Not all of them have been printed and published, by scholars. There's a huge, huge potential for people to work with them, to find new manuscripts that people haven't found before, to find new titles by mainstream scholars that we know of. There are writings that have been lost. These manuscript collections across the world, from Southeast Asia to North Africa to Central Asia, as well as to Europe and the US, scattered around the world, especially in the age of colonialism, are basically the scattered remnants of our intellectual heritage. The main manuscript collections, I would say, today are now in Istanbul, in Cairo, in Saudi Arabia. There's also major ones in India, in Pakistan, and there's others where they haven't been accumulated yet into a major repository. So for instance, if you go to Uzbekistan, many people will have manuscripts from their grandfathers or great-grandfathers that they have in their homes, but they're just sitting there and no library has incorporated them as part of their collections. And so they're at risk when there's climate change, when there's disasters. Many of these items get lost. So it's a huge responsibility for us to think about this and to, first of all, just be aware of this heritage. This is the remnants that our ancestors, our predecessors in our religion left us with, and to just keep them in our minds. Yeah, and with that, I will conclude, and I can take any questions if you have them. Sorry? No, the folio is just the sheet, and that is eventually folded, yeah. Yeah, so UCLA has the second largest collection in the country, around 8,000 manuscripts. They're acquired in the 1960s by faculty members working at the Near Eastern Studies Department at UCLA. Many of them came from Iran. There was an Armenian physician who was born in Iran and who is an Armenian-Iranian physician. And so what he would do is he would treat patients in Iran. And he had a huge interest in manuscripts, so he would just say, pay me with manuscripts. Just bring whatever manuscripts you have in your homes, and that'll be enough. So with that, he was able to amass major collections of manuscripts. And he eventually sold them to different universities, including UCLA. So a major collection came from Iran, and others also came from Turkey, from Istanbul, from Cairo. We have around 3,000 manuscripts in Ottoman Turkish alone. And they cover, all the major fields of Islamic history and sciences, from MUSHAFS to Hadith to fiqh commentaries, to books on logic, to books on Aqidah, on Tasawwuf, on Sufism, on medicine, on astronomy, astrology, every subject basically, it's there. It's accessible to the public. In theory, anyone can go and access it. There's no restrictions. All you have to do is make an account and you can go and access it. There's no issues with that. However, not all of them have been processed, and some of them need to be cataloged further. The library itself isn't completely aware of what it owns. They've just been sitting there in boxes. And so some of them have been processed, some of them have not been processed. There is a catalog of around 5,000 manuscripts that was produced in the 1970s by an Iranian scholar, and it's in Farsi. And so that's what the library relies upon, in addition to some other finding aids and tools. But it's subject to a new project that the library is trying to make them as accessible to members of the public as possible. But anyone can come and you're free to view them there.
At what time and when it started? Before it was used to be on wood writing, I think when it started, the Holy Quran, and all scripts were written on stones, first stones and then on wood. What time and what date it was written in the life of Holy Prophet, up to 10 Hijri?
Yeah, so there are several compilations of the Quran that were made from the earliest times. If I would say what survives from that time today,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be too sure. I know there's fragments that survive from around that time, but it's hard to say because sometimes there are fragments of the Mus'haf that survive nowadays, but not the complete copy. And so, for instance, you have the Tashkent Quran in Uzbekistan, which claims to be one of the original Uthmani Musahif that are composed in the time of Uthman radiallahu anh. But whether or not that's 100% true is hard to verify, at least for me. The other thing I will say is that there was a recent discovery in Yemen, in Sana'a, in the 1970s, of some of the earliest Quranic manuscripts that were found during an excavation of the Great Mosque in Sana'a by some Orientalists, and that they say could be from the time of the Prophet ﷺ or just around after his passing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I believe some people have tried that with Quranic fragments, very early Quranic fragments from the University of Birmingham and other places where they found that. And so they try to use that to approximate the date. However, I'm not too familiar with that technology and how precise it can be in dating these manuscripts to like down to the decade. So it might give them, and there's also other things to consider. Like maybe the paper was produced earlier, but was it used? Was it written in during that same time period, or was it written later? There are lots of considerations people have to take into account. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, if there are no more questions, yes. How we can get the first historic manuscript? I mean, that is something that would that's an interesting question because there is this many times people have this search for what is the first manuscript, right? Trying to see if that is the most authentic manuscript or the most reliable manuscript. But that might not necessarily be the case. It could be subject to revisions. Sometimes authors themselves would revise their manuscripts over long periods of time. And so this search for the first itself has to be subject to like further debate and consideration, like why are we looking for the first of the first? Others are also important clues of how it was reproduced and transmitted later on. And then what is like Islamic? Do you mean like the Mus'haf? Do you mean Hadith? That would require, looking through all the collections in the world, essentially, finding what people have hold up in their houses, what's beyond the national libraries, and seeing what they can come up with. So that would be a huge enterprise of like first cataloging all the manuscripts in the world, which will require several lifetimes. All right, well, Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So the next class, the next talk we'll be having, it will be December 9, I believe. It will be on the history of printing. So we'll move on from manuscripts to the age of printing, seeing how printing came in the Muslim worlds. And that also has unique stories from Istanbul to India to Cairo. Lots of labor and effort went into that. Jazakallah khair.
Testing. The dinner has been is provided and is ready outside in the cafeteria.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله